Adrian Pinto, thank you for joining me today on Acquiring Minds.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Happy to be here.
You are the new owner and now president of Georgiascapes, a commercial landscaping business in Atlanta. You bought the business in July, so it's been about 5 months. And one of the things that I really like about your story is that you were a finance guy, New York investment banking, private equity. And during that time, you saw these 8-figure, 9-figure blue collar businesses that had been built by blue collar people largely through acquisition. And you said to yourself, that seems fun. That seems possible. I'm going to do that. And here you are, 5 months into doing something similar, into this journey of what will hopefully be a blue collar empire. So we're gonna hear that story, and we're gonna hear whatever your first learnings have been in this first half year pursuing this. So start us off with just adding more color to what I just said. Give us your 2 minutes on your background and what led to this decision to want to go out and buy a business.
Yeah, sure. So I am from Erie, Pennsylvania, which is a small town in Pennsylvania. Really kind of grew up around small businesses. I mean, Erie has a couple large manufacturing companies, but that's really it. So I was always kind of interested in the idea of entrepreneurship, seeing friends and family members with small businesses. I from there went to Penn State, so stayed in Pennsylvania, and immediately after college went into corporate finance, working for GE. After about a year there, I realized that corporate finance wasn't necessarily for me, and I wanted to see something that was a little bit more transaction oriented. While I was at GE, was happened to be part of a sale of one of the businesses, and so that was kind of my first insight into investment banking. And after that experience, I realized that that was something I wanted to try myself. So was fortunate enough to get an opportunity to go do industrials, mergers, and acquisitions at Credit Suisse in New York, and I joined an analyst class there. So I was there for the 2-year program, and then at the end of the 2 years, was given an opportunity to join a private equity firm also in New York called Greenbrier Equity Group.
Greenbrier.
Yep, Greenbrier is a $6 billion industrials-focused PE fund. They primarily look at industrial services, I would say, so transportation, logistics, distribution, and then a lot of kind of business services. And so that is a kind of, that's essentially made up of a lot of blue collar businesses, like you talked about. We looked at plumbing and HVAC and electrical businesses and precision manufacturing and things of that nature. And so that gave me kind of more opportunity to see these industrial businesses essentially. And then finally, after Greenbrier, I went and joined a European family office. So still doing private equity, still looking at a lot of industrial businesses, but I left Greenbrier to go do that for the family office of a prominent family based out of Sweden.
So give us an example or two of some of these stories that you observed of these blue collar businesses that had just been grown through acquisition to really astounding values.
Yeah, so I think what was interesting was I got to see it from both sides. So when I joined Greenbrier as an associate, you get assigned portfolio companies of the existing investments that they have, and then you also spend kind of half your time on new investments. So on the portfolio side, we owned a business there. Greenbrier owns a business called Whitcraft, which is an aerospace components manufacturer based out of Connecticut. And it happened to be one of my portfolio companies, so I ended up spending quite a bit of time with the founders. And what I came to learn was that Whitcraft was built by two partners who both of which had kind of come up with an idea in business school that they wanted to go out on their own and wanted to acquire a business and kind of run it together. And so they found a relatively small components manufacturer based in Connecticut, were able to kind of raise some funds and did that acquisition themselves. And from there, they proceeded to do it was like 7 or 8 more acquisitions of similar size, and ultimately built it up to a size that was pretty prominent player in the space, and that's how Greenbrier got involved and ultimately acquired it. But the stories that I had learned from Colin Cooper, his name was, just about the process first of doing the acquisition, but also just kind of the grind associated with the early days and building it up to what it became. I just was always really drawn to that and was always really intrigued. And the thing that also really, I guess you could say, drew me to it as well is that Colin's background was in finance also. So he was an investment banker prior to going to business school, and that so he kind of came at it from a similar perspective as me, which that to me was in a situation where I was able to see that and say, oh, this is actually possible, not just for engineers or operations guys, but someone that with a finance background could do this too. And so, as I mentioned, that was kind of the portfolio side of things. At the same time, then on the new investment side of things, I looked at a lot of the business service acquisitions at Greenbrier. They don't really silo associates really, so you kind of see everything. But I just so happened to spend quite a bit of time on the business services side, and so there were a number of investments that we looked at. Ultimately, passed on most of these, but they kind of all hit similar themes that we're talking about here. So one that really strikes or stands out to me was an HVAC company. And I remember learning about it and meeting with the management team and basically hearing the story, which was that you had a guy that started a really small HVAC company, and he realized just how fragmented it was and how predominantly the whole market is just mom and pops. And so this guy went all across the United States just acquiring, 1 million of EBITDA here, 2 million of EBITDA there, and ultimately built, a business that was hundreds of million in revenue.
Incredible.
And, again, a huge player in the space. And so I think at that point, when I saw that, that was towards the kind of back end of my time at Greenbrier. And so that's when I started thinking, this guy's obviously smart, really driven, hard worker, but he's not smarter than I am necessarily. Like, he knows his industry. And so is it possible for me to do this too? Like, certainly I don't know HVAC today the way that this guy did. I didn't have a degree or a certification in it, but yeah. I felt like these are pretty simple businesses. And so if I could kind of get my head around the underlying work that they're doing, I could probably figure out the other sides of it and then utilize, this kind of private equity playbook of just being aggressive with M&A, aggressive of pursuing growth opportunities, and try to bring that down basically to this kind of SMB level.
Just on HVAC in particular, it's a very talked about target acquisition for many acquisition entrepreneurs, a very popular trade. And so it surprises me that with the attention that it gets, that it remains as fragmented as it is. I guess there's just always new mom and pops cropping up. And so there's always just kind of a churn in the industry and opportunities for more rolling up and buying up. But I'm just, I'm surprised these very popular industries persist in being so fragmented.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, and we can talk about that a little in the landscaping space because I think it's similar there too. Yeah. I mean, I would actually draw a lot of parallels just in terms of the market because in the HVAC space, there are a couple big private equity backed guys now that are, enterprise value of multiple hundreds of millions. Mm-hmm. But you're right, for as big of a market it is, there isn't a $10 billion public player, and you would think because of how attractive it is, how sticky the revenue is, you would think that would exist. And it may ultimately at some point, you may see the private equity guys that have invested in these companies, you might start seeing them kind of do some mergers of equals and put them together. But today it hasn't. But that it's an interesting business too. And the fragmentation I always thought was interesting because what the company that we looked at, what they would do is they would build partner networks in areas that they didn't serve. So they would say, hey, Will, we're not in, Florida today, but whenever we get work from our big blue chip customers, if they have stores in Florida that they want to serve, I'm going to send it to you. And what that does is, it allows them to kind of stay with their customers so the customer doesn't ever have to meet a new provider, which no one ever wants that. And B, it allows this business to build basically a pipeline of M&A opportunities. So it was really interesting because that company, a lot of their M&A that they did were previously just people in their partner network. So they just had this like organic M&A pipeline constantly growing while they were serving their customers. So they had like a pretty unique way of kind of going at M&A, I thought.
So they would send the business to this Florida partner, and then eventually, having developed a relationship over months and years, go to that Florida partner. One party would go to the other and say, "Let's transact."
Right, exactly. Because this, to your example, the Florida partner would be a mom and pop that didn't have scale, didn't have the same margins, and so these guys were in a much better position to ultimately acquire them. But as opposed to them having to build a new location in Florida to serve that customer, they'd say, no, we'll just funnel it to that mom and pop. We know we're not going to lose the broader business to this mom and pop because they're not a national player. just the Florida stuff for now, but eventually now we have a new person that we could acquire essentially.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
Back to you. So you see these stories, you're feeling inspired, I guess. So now take me through the decision to go out and do this.
Yeah, so I remember after that HVAC instance, I remember that was, I was basically, I was on my way home one evening from work, and I called a friend of mine who was in business school, and I remember kind of saying to him, like, I just want to go out and buy my own blue collar business, like as opposed to, doing all this grinding work in the PE space. Like, sure, some of it you do is investing in these companies, learning about them. That's really interesting. There's a lot of other stuff though that you're doing. And I just was kind of sick of doing some of that. And, I was telling him, like, I just want to try to do this myself. And I remember him saying, like, oh, like you're talking about like a search fund or ETA. And that was not a concept I happened to know about. But by chance, he was in business school. He was like the president of the ETA club at his business school. And so, he became all, very well versed on this. And so I remember in that car ride, he kind of explained to me the high level of it. And I was like, oh, wow, I didn't even know that was a thing. Like, it was possible basically. And so
it's so funny you're talking to the guy at his business school who's
literally,
like, yeah. And he's like, oh yeah, we share, I know something about this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because clearly he had been looking into it himself, and he's a good friend of mine, but like, there's just something we never had talked about in the past. Yeah. But so he turned me on to some of the very basic materials, the Stanford white paper, the Harvard book on it. And I remember kind of learning about the concept, continuing to be intrigued, and then simultaneously learning about some of the funding opportunities, and then that really piqued my interest because then it was no longer just, oh, this is a cool idea. It was, oh no, this is possible, and and financially, like, for basically you don't have to stretch on the finance side to be able to do it. And so,
were you kind of under the impression, as many people, including me, were, that you had to basically come out of pocket to buy the whole thing?
Well, I'd say I had the wrong view, but I looked at it a little differently. Having just done this stint in PE, everything you think of is like, oh, 4 times leverage, 5 times leverage, 6 times leverage. Yeah. So in my mind, I was like, oh, a bank will just look at a company's earnings and say, oh, we'll apply 4 times leverage to their EBITDA. But then you quickly learn, like, A, banks don't lever up, they don't provide traditional debt to cash flow debt to small businesses like that. And B, it's not clean EBITDA like you're used to seeing in Sims on the PE space, where you're getting investment bankers that are sending you these booklets and stuff. Like, this is much different. And so I quickly learned that my view of it was not going to be possible, but in fact, it actually might be better, because in the PE space, right, these days, let's say you buy a company that's for 12 times, like, you'd be pretty happy if you could get 6 turns of debt on it, so 50%. And so when I came to find out that you could do LTVs of 90% in the SBA space, utilizing the 7A loan, I was blown away. And I mean, that's when I was really like, oh wait, like, this might be something that's worth kind of digging into.
Did you while one might salivate at, wow, 90% leverage, did it also give you pause? Like, wow, that seems like really risky, given that kind of 50% was your typical benchmark coming from PE.
Yeah, well, I think what gave me pause was when I first learned about the notion of like a personal guarantee, because also, in the PE space, you utilize legal entities structures so that the PE firm's never on the hook if a company goes bankrupt, right? Yeah. That's kind of the whole point. And so when I quickly found out, like, no, it doesn't really work like that. Like, with these type of deals, like, you're guaranteeing it. That I think definitely gave me pause. I'm newly married within the last couple of years, and so we realized, like, at some point we're going to want to buy a house and all of these things. And so the idea of putting up a personal guarantee was like, it was something that needed to be talked about more than just like a snap decision, certainly.
Yeah. Okay, so you learn what a search fund is, you learn what ETA is, you learn that you can get 90% leverage. And so all of this is just good news after good news. So you decide, you make the decision to leave your, talk me through the actual decision to go out and start looking for a company and leaving your job.
Yeah. So when I was at Greenbrier in my 3rd year, they kind of came to me with the opportunity to potentially stay for a 4th year. Or, they kind of said, "Are you interested?" And I had a pretty good relationship with them, so I like to think that I would have been able to stay. But I knew what that life and the work required was to be a good associate or senior associate, and it's a lot of hours and things like that. And so once I kind of realized that this is what I want to do, it was also pretty evident that, like, I wouldn't be able to do it at Greenbrier. And so I had pretty candid discussions with them, and we kind of, I think, mutually agreed that it's probably better to part ways. And so they were very flexible in terms of giving me an opportunity to look for another position. And so what my whole plan was, find a job that will be much fewer hours, and more flexibility in my life, so that I can search on the side. I can, on the weekends, whatever, during the day, if I need to take a call, like that's all possible, which, is not the case in traditional private equity or in banking or something like that. It's nearly impossible.
Yeah.
And so I was fortunate to land this position with this European family office, great people. And, I had basically from day one kind of had this intention of like, I'm going to be looking for a business while I'm here. And, obviously I'm going to try really hard in my job. And I'd say based off of my reviews, they were happy with my performance, but it was definitely nice to be able to have the flexibility to kind of do this on the side. And then I should also say, like, COVID has been obviously a nightmare for a lot of people, but from a searching perspective, it literally couldn't have been a better thing, because instead of being in an office environment all day where people are walking by your computers or, knocking on your door and asking to talk, like, I was at my home, and it's literally the perfect situation for looking for something on the side, right? Because I can have a call here and there. It's just made it so much better. So basically I ended up spending all of 2020, working for that company, and then searching on the side. And so I kind of formally launched my search in end of first quarter 2020. So like right when COVID started, basically.
Yeah.
I had some initial hits probably within the first couple of months. And I think some of that probably was like enthusiasm associated with just starting it. I was like, oh my God, this deal is great. In hindsight, like, probably wasn't that great. But neither of those instances, when I did submit LOIs, but in neither of them were they accepted for various reasons. And, there's some learnings from those experiences. But basically, after kind of summer 2020, through the end of the year, I was getting nothing. It was, very slow on the search front. And it was starting, I would say, to get a little bit discouraging. And I should probably preface by saying I was only looking in Atlanta. And the logic from that was that I have family down there now. My wife is from the South, so we wanted to move somewhere further south, but still kind of be in a city. And so Atlanta checked a lot of boxes for us. The downside of that, though, is like when you're searching in one city, even a city with like the size of Atlanta, I mean, you are obviously limiting your options. And so, like I said, that whole kind of fall, winter time, I basically was finding nothing, which was pretty discouraging.
But you were searching from New York, so you were still in New York.
I was, yeah.
But you and your partner were had plans to go down to Atlanta.
Exactly. And I'm sure there's things that, I'm sure if I was on the ground in Atlanta, it would have been a little bit better, to meet people, and maybe things would have gone faster. The flip side is that was also like right in the beginning of the Delta variant of COVID, and so no one was really meeting anyway. So again, the dynamic of being remote was also fine because of COVID. Like it really worked out for the best, I think. But so around December of last year, about a year ago, I signed an agreement with a buy-side advisor, and the whole idea basically was that he is from Atlanta, has lived here his whole life, has tons of contacts, and he knows people selling businesses, and he will kind of get me an early in on some of these businesses, like a proprietary look, essentially, and I would pay a success fee. And so to me, it was like a no-brainer. I was like, okay, now I can have boots on the ground, basically, without having to do it myself, and I'm happy to pay a 1% success fee, which was the agreement we worked out, especially if it's truly a proprietary deal. I think the downside of that was I didn't do a good enough job of making him aware that I was going to continue to search myself. And so there was a handful of instances where he would send me listings of publicly listed businesses, whether it was on Biz Buy Sell or something, and say like, hey, here's an opportunity. This would be basically covered by our search agreement, though. And I'd have to say, like, I'm sorry, but no. Like, I've seen that too. Like, that's not helping me. Like, I hired you to kind of help me on proprietary things that no one else would have access to.
Yeah.
That did cause some tension, certainly, but ultimately in February of 2021, he came to me and said, a friend of his is selling a company, and before they kind of broadly market it, he wanted to go out to some of the people he knew in the industry to see if they happen to have clients that would be interested. So that's how I first came across George Escapes.
Adrian, let me jump in with a question. Why would I actually don't know really anything about buy-side advisors. If somebody like him has his value proposition is that he has access to deals, why wouldn't he just become a broker? I mean, that's what brokers claim to do.
I think that he would be a broker. Like, I think he would sell a company if you asked him to. I know I would say he would, what he would tell you is that he specializes on the buy side of those transactions.
Yeah.
So instead of being someone
the
that's
brokers
good at
work for sellers and he works for you.
Right, exactly. So and I think the brokers, in my opinion, without knowing a ton about the industry, but just those that I've dealt with, brokers are a little bit better at kind of marketing and the sales side of things. They get the materials out there. They're good at handling inflows of questions, stuff like that. I think the buy side advisors, for the most part, they're better. They have a good network of people that they can kind of get you inroads to, or again, so they say. And then they are, and I will say that he did do this. He had a pretty good handle on SBA lenders, both in Georgia and even nationally, that he had some connections with. Okay. So again, in his defense, like there was a couple banks that I spoke with, some of which weren't even interested in Georgiascapes. Some were, but then he basically passed me like 3 or 4 hot leads basically on the banking side, where he was like, "Hey, I already prepped these guys. They like the business. Go talk to them." So that was truly helpful, and I think that his relationships on the lending side did help.
Great. Now, so you see, okay, so tell us about Georgiascapes. He sends you this deal. Actually, rewinding a second, Adrian, I remember you telling me that what you really wanted you were really looking at electrical, HVAC, plumbing, or really kind of aiming.
Yeah, and that's entirely
and so
because...
what did you like about those, and then how did you open your mind a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. So the reason I looked at those goes back to the Greenbrier side of things, where like those are the businesses that we looked at there, and I remember that they had attractive elements. I also just remember that anecdotally private equity firms were interested, and so I was thinking, okay, well, that's always a good sign too, right? Yeah. So that was kind of how I initially approached it, but the overarching reason for those was the market dynamics. So these are large fragmented markets. They have kind of GDP plus growth. There's a lot of M&A opportunity. There's not a lot of cyclicality. They're pretty stable. So even during COVID, most of those businesses were doing well. And I figured, if a business can stay stable during COVID, that's obviously like a good test of this. So that was the reason ultimately I went after those initially. What I came to find out like almost immediately was that in Georgia, at least, if you don't have licenses for a lot of those businesses, you just can't own them. Like lenders won't lend to you. And I know that I've heard stories where people get around that by kind of signing long-term contracts with like a general manager or something that does have HVAC license, which maybe that's possible. But the lenders I spoke with said it's not worth the risk to them. If that guy leaves, something happens to him, like the business shuts down or at least has to stop. And so I just unfortunately kind of walked away from that pretty quickly. And
that probably answers why these remain so fragmented.
It might. I mean, at the same time, though, I guess the businesses that are a few $100 million of enterprise value, like they would have all the license requirements. Yeah. So I don't know that there's any reason that they can't kind of scale up a little bit more. But I think it does answer the question why so many of the fragmented businesses haven't been acquired by searchers because there are certain requirements out there. And so,
Adrian, one other question or two on your search.
Sure.
For somebody who was kind of first introduced to the concept via somebody who was was the president of their ETA program at a business school, I assume it was one of the well-known New England business schools.
Yeah.
What they're often taught is like full-time search and national search, especially if it's a traditional search fund. And so you were breaking both of those rules, which is great. You were not full time. You were doing it. You were squeezing it in, and your after hours and weekends, or in COVID maybe the occasional call during the day,
the occasional lunchtime call.
Yeah. And you were looking in a single geography. Now, the whole national search and full-time search thing, while the university programs, traditional search funds really preach that, of course, that's probably not what the vast majority of searchers do. But given that was your introduction to the whole concept, I'm interested that you flouted that norm.
Yeah, so for me, I think just the situation that we were in, what my wife does for a living and stuff, we knew we needed to be in a big city. So that kind of narrowed moving to Denver or something to do one of these, do a search out there, which, you see people going to some of these kind of emerging cities to do sometimes. And then, we thought about the family side of things, which I said, like, kind of led us to the South. And then, like I said, we kind of just centered on picking a city. And I guess part of that was, as much as I was drawn to doing search, I think maybe equally as drawn, or at least close to, was the idea that, like, I don't want to just live in the middle of nowhere just to find a business.
Yeah.
Like, it's important to me that both my wife and I have, the network and stuff around us that is, that we need. And so that, that's kind of why I picked one city. The other reason is, frankly, given that I had a job at the time, which was, I was getting paid well and it was very stable and I was doing well in it, I didn't have any rush. There was nothing that was really like forcing me to do this by a certain date, or I ran out of, search funds, right? And I mean, I can only imagine, honestly, the stress that adds, because as I was mentioning, like, those couple of deals that I did submit LOIs for and that died, had I not had an income going on during that, like, that deal fatigue would have been a real thing. And I can imagine causing some stress and potentially leading, frankly, to unwise decisions. Like, I could 100% see someone just kind of settling for a business because they've been searching for 2 years and it's just really stressful and they just can't wait anymore. I totally get that. But I just felt like it's better, while I'm living in New York, it's better to have an income and just kind of do this on the side, and it'll help me kind of make the right decision as opposed to maybe a rash one.
Excellent. Okay. So you see Georgiascapes.
Yeah.
Back to the search.
So when I first saw Georgiascapes, I remember thinking, like, initially, I just remember thinking, oh, I'm not interested in landscaping. And I think that I had preconceived notions that commercial landscaping was probably a lot like residential landscaping, which means there's a lot of pricing, a lot of kind of pricing wars amongst different companies. I probably didn't fully understand the notions of the long-term contracts in the landscaping space, and probably a variety of other things, frankly. But as I dug into the industry first, I remember immediately kind of thinking, like, wow, this checks a lot of the same boxes, right? Like, here's a multi-billion dollar industry, but the number one player only has like 1% of it. So it's super fragmented. It's growing at 4% per year. If you look at the kind of long-term trends of the industry, there's not a lot of cyclicality or variability in performance. And so I remember after seeing that, I was thinking, like, okay, this is definitely worth diving into more, because the market does look pretty attractive. And so I ended up having a couple of different calls with the owner, and just, probed on a lot of some market questions, some business questions, some team questions, because that was obviously very important to me. And as I continued to learn more and more, I just remember thinking, like, this is still checking a lot of boxes. Like, there weren't many times, especially early on, where, there was a question mark kind of on my diligence list. Like, pretty much everything, checked the boxes that I needed it to. And then the areas that it didn't, those were, to me, kind of nice to haves versus need to haves. You're never going to find the perfect SMB business. So, it fit a lot of the profile of what I was looking for.
So what you learned in kind of taking a harder look at landscaping, does that mean that you would advise, your former self or anybody out there searching now that, in fact, landscaping is a good candidate? One should be interested in landscaping companies. You like it as a category? Yeah,
I think definitely. I mean, I think that especially for someone that's interested in services business to begin with, then absolutely. I think it would be hard for me to try to convince someone that's right now searching for like a SaaS business that landscaping is the way to go, because it obviously is way different. Yeah. But if you're already interested in services, then 100%. I don't think that any of the long-term trends that I now understand 5 or 6 months into it would lead me to feel any differently basically today than I felt a few months ago. Like, I'm equally as optimistic. And I would say in a lot of ways, there's been elements of the business that have been like pleasant surprises. There's been a handful of things that I've discovered both about my business and maybe about the industry as a whole, where I've thought, like, maybe that's not ideal versus what I was hoping. But those are definitely countered by a number of things where I've kind of been very optimistic and excited about it.
Well, let's dig into those if you can remember them offhand. What are the pros, these happy pros, and these cons that you've discovered?
Well, I'd say that one of the biggest cons is ability to win new business in some of the more highly sought after areas. So I think in the commercial landscaping space, I would argue one of the kind of sexiest areas to be in. if there is a sexy area of commercial landscaping, is kind of like apartment maintenance, right? So instances where people are willing to spend high dollars on a monthly basis, but also at properties where you know that they're going to spend high percentages of their monthly maintenance in annual enhancements. So an apartment, let's say that they spend $4,000 a month on their maintenance, they might also spend $50,000 a year upgrading, the pool courtyard or something like that. And so maintenance in the landscaping space is not the highest margin area, but enhancements historically and typically are quite high margin. And so when you can balance those two things, that's a great, it's a great customer versus, let's just say you had the contract to do the landscaping at like a local small gas station, right? There's probably some grass, some shrubs, and that's it. And so that's not going to be very high margin, and chances are they're not going to spend a lot of money on that, upgrades. Mm-hmm. So anyway, in terms of, your question on the cons, I think what I've found is that, and this is both, in some ways it's good if you're that existing customer, but the contracts are so sticky, but they're also a little bit of an afterthought to property managers at times, that if if I were right now to call an apartment near me, and assuming that they answered and I was able to get someone, chances are they would say either they have a long-term contract, so they're not interested, or B, we're not unhappy with our current provider, so no need to switch. And that's a tough thing to kind of get around because you have to make your value prop really strong, right? And you can only compete so much on price because margins aren't huge to begin with. And then you're left with quality, but quality, it's a little binary, right? It's either it's good or it's not good. There's not a huge scale within that for landscaping because it is that kind of afterthought, like, oh yeah, it looks nice, but that's kind of the end of it. Yeah. So anyway, that competition aspect, I think I underappreciated it a little bit. And again, that's probably just my ignorance at the time, on the industry. But I've certainly, come to appreciate it a lot more in the last 5 months. And I think, we've made some inroads with a lot of these property managers, and I think we'll kind of stay in their ear. So at the next time that they are bidding out, properties, we'll, I think, have a good opportunity to be a part of those bids. But definitely a challenge to just kind of give someone a call and expect to get really any traction with winning a sale.
So how are you going to generate new business? Are you just going to have to do a lot of what you just described to just make your funnel wide enough so that, a few shake out at the bottom, a few new clients shake out at the bottom?
That's definitely part of it, right? It's definitely a numbers game to an extent. I think for us, one of the things that's, kind of a nice aspect is that, we had historically not had a ton of different relationships. Like Georgiascapes historically had been a little concentrated in certain places. On the landscape maintenance side, that's one area where we had a few really, really good customers. And, we're in with a lot of their properties. Some of them were in with all of their properties, which is great. So it's super sticky. I think one way to kind of, one first step basically is to kind of broaden that horizon, both in terms of property managers, but also in terms of types of properties. Like there's things that we had never even looked at in the past that are certainly viable candidates and frankly might be more easily won than some of these other things that I've mentioned. So I think that's certainly part of it, is just kind of expanding what we look at and making sure that we don't sacrifice quality or anything like that when we're doing so, but just kind of broadening our funnel. And then I think the other thing, and this kind of goes, I guess, to the pros, back to the pros cons that you mentioned, is there's a lot of areas of landscaping where I didn't appreciate how reoccurring the work was. So like, you have your contractually recurring revenue, right, which is great. Then there's the install, kind of very basic, like you call me to do something to your backyard. It's very one time in nature. You're probably not going to spend money the next year once you do it the first time. But between that, there is a huge area, which we used to call it Greenbrier, kind of reoccurring, which is that, yeah, maybe it's not contractual, but if the same customers are spending nearly the same amount of money on a monthly basis on different things, then you can pretty much kind of, you can rely on that revenue, and that is very quality revenue. And so there's a number of areas in landscaping where that exists. And so that happens to be, I would say, a side of the business that has been a big pro, basically, is seeing how reoccurring a lot of our revenue streams are and how consistent, we work with those customers and how we've been able to kind of maintain those really good relationships.
Give me an example of a reoccurring engagement, and then also tell me, what is the breakdown percentages of recurring in your business, recurring, reoccurring, and one-off?
Yeah. So, an easy example is we do work with building companies so that when a company is building a new neighborhood, let's say there's 120 homes in it, they bid out that whole neighborhood. That neighborhood will take a very long time to complete all of the landscaping and all the housing development in it. And most, large builders are doing several neighborhoods at a time, right? So with some of our companies, we're doing 4 or 5 neighborhoods at once. In those instances, that means that you might have 600 homes with one customer in any given year. And so that means basically every day or, multiple days a week, you're out there doing the same work. And so with these neighborhoods, these aren't, very customized landscape packages, right? These are very much uniform, kind of couple plants, couple trees, yep. 10 pallets of sod, that's it. And so when you have that, it's great because as a business, every day or every couple days, I'm going out to this neighborhood, I'm doing this exact work. My costs are this and they're going to pay me this. And so it's easy to track your margins. It's easy to seek areas of margin improvement because you can maybe get some volume based discounts on pricing with your suppliers. And it's, like I said, it's very easy to rely on as a company. So that has been an area that I've been really happy with, just our relationships with companies there, but also I think the opportunity. If you look at the housing growth in the Southeast, it's unbelievable. In Atlanta, it's like, I feel like every day I drive to a different area kind of on the outskirts of Atlanta, and you just see more and more neighborhoods going up. And every time I talk to a new builder, they talk about the hundreds and hundreds of homes that they have in the budget for the next few years. And so that's been a very pleasantly surprising area for me.
Tell us about the size of Georgiascapes. What was and the numbers behind the deal?
Yeah, so we do anywhere between 3 and 5 or so million of revenue at kind of 15 to 20% margins, I would say.
That's great.
And the deal, and so when I initially got into an LOI, I thought I was kind of getting in a little south of 3 times, but in that realm. And I've been fortunate because the business has just been growing like crazy, kind of across the board. Maintenance, the reoccurring side, the install side. That multiple has come down significantly, probably closer to 2 times, maybe probably right around 2-ish times now.
Incredible.
So,
and did the seller not
fortunate.
realize? Were they not seeing similar growth in 2020, 2019, 2018, such that? He could have negotiated for a stronger multiple, projecting, really strong 2021 and 2022?
Well, honestly, so I think that there was an element where people were turned off by the lack of purely maintenance revenue. So to answer your initial question, we probably do 35% of the business is truly contractual maintenance but then the install side, right, the truly one time is maybe 10% of the business. So, that bulk in between is a lot of this kind of what I would describe maybe being a little bit marketing myself, but, that's what I would describe as kind of reoccurring. And so I think that may have turned some people off, honestly. And I would be lying if I said it didn't turn me off when I first saw it and purely not knowing what it was. But
some lenders, looking at that mix of maintenance versus true maintenance, true recurring versus, so-called construction revenue, they might not even lend on it if the
100%. That was right. I definitely, we had that reaction I had that reaction by one lender, certainly. I think, again, I would argue that if the lender took a chance to understand what that business is, you would feel differently. And I think the proof there is look at, our top 5 customers in what I would describe as the reoccurring space and look at what their performance was over the last 5 years, and you'd be blown away how consistent it is.
Yeah.
Right. It's honestly unbelievable. And so that to me, when I was doing my diligence, that was really how I kind of got comfortable, is just simply looking at the performance of these customers over time. So to answer your question also from the owner's or the seller's perspective, this business actually, so it had grown about 5% per year for the past 5 or 6 years. So on a total top line basis. So it had been really consistent growth. I think that I just happened to kind of get in there at the right time where we've seen kind of a big uptick since that, since kind of that kind of consistent growth period.
To now have effectively paid a 2x for a $3 or $4 million business doing 20% margins. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
go
ahead.
I'm pretty excited about it. No, I was just going to say, I think that I mean, and this again is like me with my PE hat on, but this is one of the elements that always attracted me to the space was the idea that you could potentially get in on a business at 2 or 3 times, but once you generate some scale, whether that's organically or through M&A, the multiple expansion and then ARB that you get there is incredible, right? And so that truly is exciting to me, just seeing, where we're at today, what I got it for, and what I think that the business is going to be worth both in 6 months and in 3 years or whatever. And so that's really exciting to me.
Tell the audience what ARB means.
Sorry, like arbitrage. So like I would argue, let's say a business is doing 5 million of revenue, maybe that's worth 4 or 5 times purchase multiple. Let's say 4 times for easy. So if you buy it for 3 times purchase multiple and you sell it for 4 times purchase multiple, embedded within that is a turn of multiple expansion, which is pure kind of profit or cash flow generative to the overall transaction at exit.
Mm-hmm. You had said earlier when talking about, I think the first example of the guys who bought the manufacturing business, essentially an engineering business, but they were finance guys and went on to
one was a finance guy. The other, his partner was an engineer.
Okay. But
yeah.
it made you feel like, oh, okay. So I might not have to be an engineer myself to do something like that. A finance person could get into a business like this. The flip side of that is like looking at where you are now, what you're embarking on, and buying this first business, and assuming there's a playbook to buy more and more and more. I see your finance experience and your PE experience as this great advantage because M&A and understanding what ARB is and how it works as one example. That's its own skill and a skill that took you some number of years to develop. So the question is like, say I'm listening to this interview and I'm not somebody with a New York investment banking or PE background. How well situated am I to go out and do what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think during the acquisition process, especially, there was benefits of my background, of having my background, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, the process of building, some financial forecast, working with a lender to put together a cash flow model and, showing them kind of the payback period and all of that, like that's kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis anyway. So right. To me, that was in some ways that was the easy part. Whereas I know I've had discussions with people that are maybe in operations and, to them running the business, they're so excited. They're like, that'll be easy. I run crews of 50 people, like, that'll be no problem. But I'm not really sure how to do the acquisition side of things. So for me, it was almost it was the inverse of that. Whereas like I was a little, nervous of like, okay, I've never run a company before, and so yeah. I've witnessed a lot of that, on the PE side, and that's kind of what I pitched to the lender in a lot of ways. Is like, listen, as an associate, you are kind of the liaison between your portfolio companies and the PE firm, and so I would sit out at, the aerospace company. Help with the budgeting process, walk the shop floor with the CEO and understand what's going on with the flow lines and, the lean manufacturing, projects that they're working on. But ultimately, I never did that. And so that was definitely an area I would say for me where I was a little more apprehensive. But I would say, to answer your initial question, I think that learning the acquisition side is frankly probably easier than the business side of things. So if you're someone that has experience working with teams, or maybe it's in operations, maybe it's in marketing or whatever that is, but, kind of working with people to kind of achieve a collective goal. Like, I think that frankly is more important than simply knowing how to build a model. Like, I think you could watch a 3-hour YouTube video and probably figure out some of that stuff. And yeah, I mean, you're not going to figure out everything, but I think the lenders, frankly, they do help you along the way. They recognize that the nature of the SBA 7A loan is not just to give finance guys loans, right? So that they want to work with people that have a variety of backgrounds and make it accessible to kind of everyone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And speaking of M&A and more M&A, so how do you feel now that you've been in the business? You really are seeing what a kind of a blue collar business looks like from the inside. About your original vision of buying one and then another and scaling it out. Is that vision still intact, or are there some chips around the edges?
So I would say in terms of an opportunity standpoint, I feel 1,000 times better today than I even felt when I started.
Really?
It's crazy. I mean, if I'm driving around during the day, so it just so happens that where our business is located is near a couple different highways outside of Atlanta. And so it's like a ton of landscaping businesses around there because you can just quickly jump on the highway and get to where you need to be. And so, if you go to lunch or something, out near my office, I mean, you might see 4 or 5 different landscaping companies just driving around at any one point in time. And so I literally have like a notepad on my phone that when I'm driving,
Gonna buy him.
I mean, I'll just type their names down because I'm like, and sometimes you find out like, oh, that company was just acquired for $800 million, and you're like, okay, maybe that one I will shy away from. But honestly, I mean, the opportunity. I think the opportunity set in the Southeast, but also just in general, it's really incredible just how many kind of mom and pop landscaping opportunities are out there. So I feel great about that. I really do. I would say that from a, like the ability to actually do it. I mean, I definitely appreciate now more the difficulties of, from an internal perspective of doing M&A, right? So, when you're in the PE world, it's really easy to kind of tell your portfolio companies like, hey guys, in the budget this year, like let's put a few deals in there. Like we should do some add-ons. Like it would be great to kind of jumpstart the growth. It would look good when we're trying to sell the company to say that you guys did M&A. And a lot of times they kind of say, okay, yep, we'll start working on that or whatever. But I don't think as an associate, I had any idea of what that really means in terms of like getting it done from a process standpoint internally. I mean, now thinking about that sitting where I am, like the idea of doing an acquisition, immediately, you start kind of going through the steps required in your mind. Like, what are you going to have to do? Well, I'm going to integrate their QuickBooks. I'm going to have to set up, the combined payroll. I'm going to have to do all this. And so I'm incredibly bullish on it, both, because of the opportunities, but still just because I'm excited about that opportunity. But I do definitely recognize that it won't be, a plug and play situation, right? We don't have as a small business, especially one that I just recently took over. So the processes are not quite in place yet, I think, to easily kind of absorb another company. So it will be a challenge when we first do it. And hopefully before then we can kind of tick some of these boxes in terms of, improving processes that'll make it easier to absorb stuff. But, like I said, I am very excited about that. I think that is a great way to kind of get some growth. And frankly, when you look at an industry that isn't SaaS, right? It's not growing double digits. Like M&A it's the best tool in your toolbox to accelerate growth. And so if that exists in your market, I mean, I think you should got to take advantage of it. And then it goes back to the whole scale benefits, right? Like doing the M&A I mean, if I can buy a couple small ones at 2 times, now then all of a sudden my combined business is worth a much greater multiple. And so that benefit is pretty impressive as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I as somebody relatively recent to this world and to the principles of private equity, learning about multiple arbitrage is kind of it's a mind blowing phenomenon. I mean, if you're from PE, it's normal, but it's kind of a weird thing to think that you can just, it's truly the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of the parts situation. It's just like I had these 2 companies together, and all of a sudden their combined profit was worth more than they were individually. That's kind of counterintuitive, but that's how it works.
Right. I mean, I completely agree with you. And I think when you look at it from like a PE lens where, those businesses are worth 10 to 12 times, but they're able to acquire businesses for 3 to 5 times. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's like, you're telling me I'm going to double the value, the transaction value or the enterprise value of this company just by me acquiring it. Like, how does that make sense?
Right.
But that's just the scale benefits that exist out there. So, trying to bring that down to the SMB level is something that I definitely am focused on.
Going back to what you were just saying about kind of getting some stronger processes in place and tightening up the existing operation before you can think about doing M&A reminds me of your chassis Twitter thread.
Yeah.
Talk about this chassis concept.
Yeah, so actually that was a discussion that I had with Colin, the guy that I mentioned that founded that aerospace business. So him and I have remained in touch a little bit. He's just a terrific guy. And so I had pinged him a couple weeks ago, just kind of saying, hey, I hadn't been talking to him in probably a year. And I said, look, I ended up doing
in your footsteps, man. I mean, tell me what you got.
One of the last things I talked to him about, I remember was, hey, like, I'm kind of interested in doing something like this. And I remember him saying like, cool, like, let's see what you got. Let's see what you got. Yeah. And so, I pinged him a couple weeks ago and I said, hey, I did it. But anyway, I was kind of like, what what advice would you have early on? So as he thought about, what I was trying to get at was basically what did he think about in those early days to set the business up for future success, both in terms of team structure, maybe it's processes, like whatever it is, because I think that one of the challenges I see is like, you could kind of go a million different ways with your business, right? I could hire this type of person. I could hire that type of person. I could try to, focus just on sales and bring in a sales director or whatever. Or I could try to, perfect the existing team and focus on operations. Like, how should I think about this? And I just wanted to get his perspective, given that, in my opinion, he did it perfectly. And so his point was, your goal needs to be 100% focused on building a chassis that you can then take other businesses and put on top of. So if, and I know the one thing he always used to talk about is data. So they used, like an Oracle ERP system. And the reason they did that was because if they can make all of their data perfect today, so they know their costs exactly, they know, everything required to understand margins, then when they acquire a business, it'll be very easy to integrate them into their systems, and they can very quickly, figure out, where might there be some cost benefits, like what can they do to improve that business, but it'll make that integration process very easy. And I actually remember, like, when we did a couple deals with their company, the day that kind of the funds flowed and the transaction went through, they had like a day long integration of their systems, and then like they were ready to go, and their systems were like combined. They just had remarkable systems on their back end. And so Colin's point to me though was like, think about that, I think, from an SMB perspective, which is like, you're not going to maybe have Oracle's $1 million ERP system, but like, what can you do to make your business today that chassis that other things can easily go on top of? So I think a perfect example that we're working through right now is, we have very archaic payroll processes, which stem from kind of the prior organization, and to the point where like literally each one of our employees is filling out a physical timesheet every single day with where they went, what did they do, took lunch here, finished lunch here, got back to the office here, and they're handing it in. But the silly thing is, first of all, they don't do it until the next day, so the data is not even accurate to begin with. And second of all, we utilize telematics, and so we know that information anyway. And so my whole point was like,
telematics is a kind of a GPS enabled thing that shows you where everybody is and basically tracks them.
Yeah, exactly. And so my whole thing was, one, if we actually care about where they were, we know that anyway, right? So we use Samsara. You can run automated reports that come out every Sunday that tell you every property that they were at and how long they spent there. So that benefit of the payroll sheets is gone. And then the other benefit is, when time did they get in? What time did they leave? And I was like, well, let's just put in a time clock. Like we can just give them a code. They punch it in when they leave in the morning, they punch it in when they get back, and we'll just assign them an hour for lunch. So as opposed to them like filling out like, oh, I started taking lunch at 12 and I finished at 1, like there's no benefit to me to know that information. And so if I know what time they left, know what time they get back, they have to take an hour of lunch, we'll say, which they do anyway. And we already know their location. I was like, we just simplified everything. And so we're, by utilizing the Samsara technology, by, a time clock, and then pairing that with, we're going to use like ADP or one of the payroll processors, which today we just have our accountant take, these physical timesheets, and she processes payroll manually. So it's an incredibly archaic system, and it's not built to scale. So if we went and did an acquisition tomorrow and added 10 more people, it would just be a massive headache to our current process, right? And so just back to the chassis point, is like, we're not set up for that today. But I think there's some pretty simple things like that we can do that will get us a lot closer to being ready to do that. And so I'm hopeful that, over the next couple of months, we'll be able to, kind of cross off all that low-hanging fruit and be in a much better position to kind of,
closer
go
to the
after
chassis.
M&A. Yeah.
It's interesting. There are two modes of thought. One is that like, all these SMBs out there, they're so mom and pop, they're so unsophisticated. If you see a fax machine on premises, it's like there's incredible low hanging fruit. The kind of the fax machine test. But then you'll hear other people say that that's way overplayed. That in fact, these businesses, it's like whatever, moving everybody to G Suite or some tech solution, like just throwing technology at the business doesn't magically make them better, more profitable businesses overnight. But in fact, what I'm hearing that is in your case is kind of like, well, that your case is kind of more of the former thinking, and it's bearing that out. That everything that you just described is basically some tech solution to some archaic process that currently exists.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point. I think that it's somewhere in between. And what's interesting to me about that is like when you think back to, I think the initial private equity model stemming from like the 80s, right? Barbarians at the gates was the whole idea was go after these bloated corporate companies. You go in, you acquire them, you cut a bunch of costs, right? This is back when taxes were super high, so people were using like, country club memberships and all these like perks to try to, get people to come work there, right? And so you look at like KKR and stuff and what they did back then, and it was a lot of cutting these bloated overhead costs, and that's how they generated their money. The interesting thing about SMBs, it's like the exact opposite. Like at least, with George Escapes, I mean, the business was so lean, both in terms of processes and people, that anything we do from a tech perspective is going to be incremental costs. So like there isn't cost savings opportunities in a lot of instances. Like in a lot of instances, it's actually costing more, but it's about like efficiency. And then, like I said, the whole chassis dynamic. So, by going to a new payroll, like it's going to cost more than it costs today, 100%, but it's not going to be a huge difference. And it'll make it 1,000 times easier rather on, Rachel, who works for me, she's the bookkeeper, and it'll also make it much easier to kind of scale this up if we take on more people. Yeah. So a worthwhile cost. The tracking situation I mentioned, that was not inexpensive, but there's a lot of benefits to it. And if we're going to have, newer vehicles and stuff, like we've got to know where that stuff is. And so to me, worth it. But I do think that there is a dynamic in the SMB space where, if you accepted every different SaaS solution out there, you'd spend so much money, and then you would need another SaaS solution just to aggregate all your SaaS solutions. Like there's so many things, it's crazy, right? And we get calls all the time from different people. Oh, like what if let's talk to you about this CRM or this benefits tool or this whatever. And so I think that the one challenge almost in the SMB space is like you have to be careful that you don't try too much, because it would be really easy to do that, and then you would end up just spending like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars a month. And frankly, I think it would complicate and confuse people. Like that's been one of my biggest focuses since starting, is making sure that as motivated and as excited as I am, I'm not overwhelming people with a million ideas. And so, I'm trying to go at this slowly. I'm trying to learn the processes before just, suggesting like, what if we change it to this? Because I don't know all the reasons why we do it today. And so like I should learn those first before kind of suggesting changes. So anyway, now that we're 5 months in, I feel much more comfortable kind of going to the team about different things and saying like, all right, I have a good understanding of why we do this now, but I think this actually does make sense. And by doing that, I think it's limited the number of things I've tried to change, but it's also, I think, made those things, more important.
Kind of slowing your roll and waiting five months and really understanding the business, that's an important part of the transition. And that's where a lot of acquisition entrepreneurs stumble, is that they're so ambitious, they're so eager, they want quick wins. So they come in day one and they're like, G Suite, Notion, CRM. Let's SaaS this place, people. What was your experience? I mean, did you do that and quickly learn that you shouldn't do that? And also just a point about the kind of like, here you are, this New York guy moving to Atlanta, buying a blue collar business. You could see how there might be some cultural friction there within the company. Was there?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it definitely helps that, working at a place like Greenbrier with industrial businesses, like I spent a lot of time walking shop floors and being immersed into those kind of experiences where I felt pretty comfortable kind of just going into a blue collar office and saying like, yeah, you're right, I'm not going to wear a suit anymore, but that's okay. Yeah. It is funny because I bought a truck, and I would say historically, people that worked with me would not think that I'm a truck driving guy, but when in Rome, you kind of you gotta do what they do. So,
is it an F-150?
It's a GMC.
Okay.
But so that was definitely, it was a unique experience, but I felt pretty well equipped for it. I would say, to answer your first question, yeah, I mean, I watched in the PE space, every time we would do a deal, you would kind of develop like a 100-day plan. What are your goals for the company in the first 100 days? And these are things that as the PE firm, you're hoping that they do. So you're kind of giving them some advice, some things that you want them to work on or whatever. And so, I mean, I kind of similarly developed this like 100-day plan. where I was like taking notes on things and what, keeping that in the back of my mind. But at the same time, especially in the first couple of days, I would go have discussions with people that I work with, and I would ask questions like, okay, so how do we do this? How do we do that? And they would tell me. And I think I, at times, did not remember that whole notion of like let's go slow at this, and so I just, as an excited person, would be like, oh, that's interesting. Like, have you ever thought about doing it this way? Or, oh, like, what about if we tried this? And it was pretty evident pretty quickly that that by doing that, people were a little more apprehensive that I was going to just like blow the place up and start over. And that was never my intention. And I didn't want to make anyone like freaked out or anything like that. And so, after a couple of days of that and seeing that like that wasn't the best approach, I very much scaled this back to where I took notes on questions on things that I thought maybe could be improved upon. But I waited. I didn't just go to the person the next day and say like, hey, can we talk about these items? I waited to see if I could learn the reason we did or didn't do some of these things. And I think that was a much better approach because
Sounds very wise.
Yeah, I ended up learning a lot more about the business that way. And then so it was actually just a couple weeks ago, we had a discussion where I took all my notes from the first 5 months. I broke them into kind of like finance, the 2 divisions of our company, operations topics, things like that. And we had a whole team discussion for like 3 hours. And it was so much better because at that point I'm more informed. So I'm coming from a place of understanding when I'm asking these questions. Yeah. So now these are not like stupid questions. These are like, no, I know why we're doing this, but let's talk about, X. And I think that was much better. And I think that the team appreciated it a million times more because it was just much more thoughtful by doing it this way. So I'm really happy with how that turned out. But there were some stumbling blocks certainly immediately because, like I said, I was just one of these excited, ambitious people, and I, talk a lot. And so, it was just one of those things where I was ready to go kind of day one. But I think that I needed to kind of, pare that back.
So that sounds awesome. So just to kind of formalize that into a best practice people can learn from. So you basically kind of gathered notes, literal notes and kind of mental notes over the course of close observation for 4 or 5 months, and then collected your thoughts and, organized these notes into categories. And I assume you prioritize them. And then you gathered everybody together into a group meeting and you said, hey guys, I've been here for 5 months now. Here's some things that look like opportunities to me, but I want to hear how you feel about them. Let's go through this list. And was that kind of the way it went?
Yeah, 100%. And if you looked at my notes, it's funny because you would see like dozens of things that have been crossed out because those are things that I maybe wrote down 4 months ago, but then a month later learned like, oh wait, we can't do that because of this. And if I would have asked that question, I would have gotten that answer, but it also maybe would have caused some friction or whatever. And so I wanted to like learn some of that. And so basically what I went to them with was a much more refined kind of list of things.
Yeah.
And I think, I think it was good because it allowed them to kind of chime in, give their perspective on different things. It also generated a discussion, right? Because now you have 5 people talking together and maybe someone feels one way about something. And there was an instance where like I brought up an idea, one person kind of still wasn't all on board with it. But 2 other people were like, nah, that actually is a pretty good idea. And then we had a group discussion and it was great. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was a huge benefit of it. The other thing is like, and this goes, I think, to like formalizing processes a little bit in SMBs, but they didn't used to have kind of like an annual like budget or goals discussion. And so I also use this meeting as a way to like, let's formalize some of our plans or goals for next year. So here are some ideas I have. Maybe some of these suck. Maybe some of them are interesting. But as part of this discussion, let's pick out what we want to focus on next year. And sure, part of that's financial, right? So we can set up a little bit of a budget for each of the divisions. Again, something that they never did in the past. But now we have a target to go after. But also operationally and from a process perspective, we can use some of these ideas, assuming that they like them, as things that we want to now target for this coming year. And so as part of that, there was a number of things, whether it be on the business development front or streamlining processes. But we were able to kind of pick those, I think, out of this list. And not everything we even chose came from my list. Like by me, I think my list kind of generated a discussion, and some of the part of that discussion ended up kind of resulting in better ideas that came about from the groups talking. So I think it was a good way to bring about ideas, but not in a way that would ultimately like stress people out or kind of overwhelm people.
we're wrapping up here, Adrian, but I want to circle back a few minutes to going back to M&A and acquisition and the chassis. One of the things I kept hearing you say about building this chassis, positioning the company to be robust and kind of a foundation. I mean, that's really what we mean by chassis, like have this first company be such a strong foundation that it can more easily absorb and integrate future acquisitions. I heard you say a lot of it was around like process and systems and tech. What about culture? Like if you imagine, because I would imagine that the people thing would be the hardest part of all. So if you imagine yourself buying another commercial landscaping business in Atlanta, do you imagine that all of those people start working together, or do you keep them as discrete offices and you don't really have to integrate people or culture? How do you think about that?
Yes, that's a great question. So I think that the office question has to do with geography. So if, let's say, we're on the east side of Atlanta, let's say we found a business that was on the west side, I would never probably integrate because I think that there's a lot of benefits now. We have a presence on both sides. And if you know anything about Atlanta traffic, driving from east to west is a nightmare. So like there would be a ton of benefits to that. I think that if the other office was close to us, maybe you would look to integrate. I think that at the size that we're probably looking at, if there is an office presence, which I'm sure there would be something, but it would be very limited, right? And I think similar, kind of as you often see in the SMB space, you kind of have an owner who maybe does some account management, some sales, some estimating. Often you have maybe one other employee that does kind of the bookkeeping side of things, and then you have some crews. I actually think that structure lends itself really well for acquisitions because crews can be integrated, I think, pretty easily. Certainly every business has a little bit of a culture, but as long as the quality of the crew's work is good, I think that you can kind of mix crews more easily than maybe you could at a 50-person company where there's all these back office people that now are going to be sitting together.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Versus like if I bought a couple crews, they're just going to keep working with their existing customers anyway.
Yeah.
For the most part.
Exactly.
So that actually I think lends itself really well. I do think that there's an element of there is still some cultural issues. I think we're in a unique situation though because we're growing. When I took over, it was really there was one person kind of doing finance stuff, and then we had one person working on estimating and kind of account management. We've since added a number of people kind of on the manager side of things. So we're kind of developing our own culture today anyway. So I think we're in a good position to be amenable to another culture. It's not like we have very rigid guidelines that like it's our way or the highway. Like I think we're in a position where if there's a best practice, we'll take it, and if ours is better than theirs, then great. And so I think that makes us potentially a more attractive acquirer in some ways because it's not just this big hierarchical business. A lot of people I think in services companies will shy away from selling. Or theoretically working for one of these big guys because it's just layer after layer after layer. It takes 10 phone calls to ever get a decision made. It just can be really hard to kind of operate in that environment. And so I think that we're being much more nimble, much more flat. I think we could be actually a pretty attractive acquirer for a lot of people.
Yeah, of course. Victim of your own success. As you successfully acquire all these companies, you inevitably become bigger, and then some of that goes away. So, are your old colleagues from the private equity world looking at what you're doing now and being like, "WTF?" or are they jealous?
Well, it's funny because that guy that I mentioned that was head of the ETA club.
Yeah.
He went back to private equity. He's at the biggest of the private equity firms now, and so. Him and I will text all the time, and every once in a while he'll have a tough week or something. He'll be like, "Man, I am jealous," because I think he still has that kind of burning desire a little bit to have done something on his own. But I think that they're all like really excited. I think I think most people in the PE space see the value of it, see like that it's what someone in their kind of position could bring to a company, and I think everyone gets a little burnt out, honestly. And so I think that like. The desire of someone in the PE space that's been around of a bunch of like CEOs and industrial companies, I think that pretty much everyone I've told this to that I used to work with, their first reaction is like, "Oh wow, that's cool." Like basically none of them knew it was also possible, and it's interesting to just about everyone. So I think that they're both excited for me, but definitely a little bit jealous.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Adrian, I found you on Twitter. What is your Twitter handle, and is that the best way for people to reach you if they have questions or want to connect with you directly?
Yeah, so my Twitter handle, I was just looking. Not, a little new to the Twitter game, I would say. I think it's Adrian _ Pinto 2, the number 2.
Okay.
I would say the easiest way to get in touch with me, though, is LinkedIn, Adrian Pinto, georgiascapes.com, or my email is adrian@georgiascapes.com. And I'm always happy to have these discussions with anyone that's interested in kind of looking at the ETA space or thinking about making the jump into search. And it's always fun for me to talk about ideas and to talk about different businesses. I mean, that was probably the thing I liked about PE the most, was just always getting to evaluate another company. So I always enjoy calls with searchers who are saying, hey, I'm looking at this business, curious what your thoughts are. So always happy to have those discussions.
Well, I may personally take you up on that at some point in 2022, Adrian.
Yeah, please.
This has been great. Thanks. A lot of great thoughts here. A lot. We went deep. We went longer than I intended to, but it was because it was just a lot of gold here. So thanks a lot, Adrian. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.